to join us for the next 4 Thursday nights. If this is good enough to beat the debate, then hopefully it'll be good enough to beat the whatever else is showing the next three Thursdays after tonight. As Jeff said, I'm Andrew Packman. I'm good friends of Jeff and Ariane from back in our Hyde Park days. We're actually knew Pastor Allison as well. We were all in seminary together at the same time. And Hyde Park produces a lot of pastors, as you all know, but I hope that these congregations know how lucky you are to have two of the best in Jeff and Allison. These are fine leaders, and the fact that they want to engage this topic and that you all do too is evidence of that. So I'm very happy to receive an invitation from Jeff and to join you all. I live out in St. Charles. I'm still a student at the Divinity School, but I live out in the west suburbs where my wife is a Lutheran pastor. And I'm a pastor in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and my ministry for the last several years has been one of study and research. So I'm finishing a PhD in theology and ethics at the University of Chicago, and my dissertation addresses race from a theological perspective. So I'm interested in why it is the case that even all these years after the Civil Rights Movement, after most Americans explicitly reject racist views and racist prejudices are on the decline, why it's still the case that race seems to be so present in all of our lives and seems to be front page news. So this topic is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I'm happy to share a few insights with you all over these next few weeks. I do want to say right from the start, though, that just because I've thought about this for a long time and I've read a lot of books, doesn't mean that I'm any closer to being an anti-racist person or racially just myself than anyone else here. Racism is kind of like basketball. You can read a lot about it, but that doesn't make you especially good at stopping being that way. And that's, in fact, one of the topics of my dissertation. So I wanted to start kind of from a place of humility and say that race still confounds me. I feel awkward when race gets brought up in conversations like it does for most of us. When I teach about race in university classrooms, I find myself worrying that I'll say the wrong thing. When I'm driving through the west suburbs where I live and I see a Black person walking down the street, I am still surprised because there are so few Black people that live out here. And when images from the most recent episode of racial violence shows up on my TV screen, I feel the same consternation as many of you about what to do. So I share all of this just to say that I don't have this all figured out, and whatever authority I have on these matters doesn't stem from a spotless track record on race. It's rather that I have had the liberty to spend a lot of time reading and thinking about it. And so that's where this comes from, and I hope that it helps think a little bit more coherently about race tonight. So let me try to share my screen. I've got a presentation to show. Let's see if this works. Okay, does everyone see this? Coming to terms with race, a primer of America's original sin. So I want to say a few words about why this class and why now. So the most immediate reason has to do with the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department officer Derek Chauvin back in May. This is not the first instance of this kind of violence, but of course it has brought it to our national attention because it was recorded and we've all seen the images ourselves. So there's a felt need in the United States to discuss these topics. And yet, those conversations are often very fraught and confusing. Race is a lightning rod in American politics, and it can feel like no matter what you say, you're going to say the wrong thing. There's an increasingly large vocabulary for talking about race that includes terms that aren't always very clear or have clear definitions. What is race? How many races are there? What do you mean by racism? Does it come in different varieties? So this combination of fraughtness and confusion frequently keeps us from talking about the very thing that we feel the need to discuss. So the goal of this class is very simple. I just want to provide a primer on race in American life, one that helps us come better to terms with race. That means, first, that I want to get a kind of common vocabulary for our group to talk about race. That'll be the topic of tonight's conversation. But I also want to come to terms with race on another deeper level. Race is an idea with a vocabulary. It's a social institution with a history. To come to terms with race means taking a closer look at some of the bleakest moments in American history, to ask how a nation that's supposedly founded on the self-evident truth of human equality was quite literally built by enslaved Africans. But race is not just an idea with a vocabulary or an institution with a history. It's also a sin with a power all of its own. So to come to terms with race as Christians means thinking theologically about the way race continues to order our world and infuse its evil into our most seemingly innocent rational choices. So the course schedule is going to be going over 4 weeks, and we'll address a different topic each time. Tonight, I'll go through race as an idea, an institution, and as a sin, and kind of set up a framework for the course. Next week and the following week, we'll do some more historical work. So next week, we'll discuss racism as an overt, explicit form of oppression, and that covers the period of American history from slavery, 19 until the civil rights movement. Then in week 3, we'll track a transition in the shape that racism takes in the United States when most people stop believing that Black people are inferior to white people, and yet these racist or racial disparities persist. And so I'll zoom in very closely on our own back to Chicago to see how these racial distinctions and barriers to economic improvement persist in the housing market in Chicago. And then on the last week, we'll go even closer yet to the kind of biases that lurk in the recesses of our minds that even people that don't want to be racist still empirically have been shown to have. So the process will be kind of starting big and bringing it narrower, 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 and hopefully along the way developing a vocabulary to talk about this so that these churches of which you're part can speak intelligently about this. So I'm going to say a few things about how we'll proceed tonight, but are there any questions so far? If there are, as this screen shows right here, I'll be speaking for about 45 minutes tonight in presentation. If you have questions along the way, please just stay muted, but type your question into the chat function of Zoom so that Pastor Jeff can see that you have a question, and he will politely interrupt and bring my attention to it so that I can address your thoughts. I want this to be, I wish we were in a room and we could all engage in person, but of course that's not safe for any of us right now. So this is the next best shot. So bring your questions, and if anything I say doesn't make sense or sounds off, then do say so. So after the 45 minutes of me talking, we'll break out into small groups of 3 or 4. Jeff will do that just at the push of a button, and we'll respond to a few questions that I'll pose, and then at the end, we'll all come back together to discuss what was discussed in those groups. Any questions so far? Does that all sound kosher? Okay. Oh, finally, Jeff mentioned this earlier, but we are going to record the session tonight, so that will just be me presenting. So you don't need to worry, but I just want to let you know that just to be sure. Great. So race as idea, institution, and sin. Race seems to be everywhere in America, whether it's immigration, policing, affirmative action, income inequality, what to do with Confederate monuments, or the expanding scope of American prisons. Race figures into every one of our hot-button political issues. Race is one of the first things we notice when we encounter another person. It's written all over our faces. This makes race different than your religious affiliation or your national identity. Your racial identity, in most cases, is broadcast for everyone to see. Social psychologists have discovered that we categorize people according to race in the first 100 milliseconds of perception. That means that we see a person's race even before we've detected their gender. That's so fast that even if you went through life trying your best not to see color, to see the person and not the race, you will have already seen it. It will have already registered at a neurological level in your mind. This is bad news, but race is already in our kids. Despite myths that children don't see race, these psychological studies show that infants as young as 6 months old have been shown to non-verbally categorize people by their race at 6 months. By the time toddlers are 2, they can use racial categories to predict people's behavior. And 3 to 5-year-olds have been shown to not only categorize people by race, but also to express racial biases. Now, most scholars think that these biases are not explicitly taught by people's parents. Rather, children just pick them up. They're just patterns of behavior that we kind of intuit by osmosis, whether we want to or not. Now, race is woven into nearly every aspect of American life. Economically, racial identity bears a strong correlation with how much money you'll have in the bank and how much income you earn each year. This chart is a 2016 study by the Brookings Institute, and it shows that the average white family has a net worth, now this is wealth and not income, this is accumulated wealth, that's approximately 10 times higher than the average black family. That's a shocking statistic. I just want to clarify that. For the average white family, the net worth is $171,000. For the typical black family, the average net worth is $17,000. Now, it's important to note that these figures come well after the civil rights movement. This isn't a wealth gap from the 1880s or from the 1940s, but from 2016. And in a 2015 study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, they found that the median net worth for white families in Boston was $247,000. And the same figure for black families was $8. Not 80,000, not 800, but 8, indicating that most of them are underwater in debt. In terms of employment, race factors into who gets hired in the first place, and for those who do get hired, who gets promoted. From 2010 to 2019, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that black employment numbers were roughly twice that of white unemployment. And in a 2004 study, researchers responded to help wanted ads in Chicago and Boston newspapers by submitting fictitious resumes that were completely identical except for the name at the top of the resume. Half the applications had white-sounding names like Greg and Emily, and half the applications had black-sounding names like Lakeisha and Jamal. Despite being the exact same resume, the white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than the black-sounding names. And as of February 2020, only 4 CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies were black and 10 were Latino, meaning that more than 97% of the wealthiest companies are led by white people. Race strongly determines where we live. This map of Chicago is from 2000, so it's a little bit dated, but it shows you what anyone who's ever taken a bus across town already knows. The pink spots are where predominantly white areas, black is blue, and the Hispanic sections are orange. It's also been shown that where you live plays a role in how long you will live. I actually found this out from Pastor Jeff. If you live in Chicago's Streeterville neighborhood, where the majority of residents are white, you can expect to live to be about 90 years old. But if you live 9 miles to the south in Englewood, right by Hyde Park, where the majority of residents are black, you can expect to live 30 years less, to only 60. Race is everywhere we look, but what is it? We have an intuitive feel for what race is and how it works. We know that white churches feel different than black churches. We know that white neighborhoods look different than black ones. Each of us who has lived for longer than a few years in this world has at least some gut level sense for what race is. But when we start to probe a little bit and ask questions, things start to fall apart. How many races are there? Classically, there were thought to be 4: white, black, red, and Asian. But of course, South Asians from India look a lot different than Asians from Japan and China. And those Asians look different than people from Kazakhstan. And white people from Sweden don't exactly look like white people from Spain and Portugal. Some racial categorizing schemes have up to 27 different races. How do you determine which race you are? This gets more complicated because who it is that fits within a certain race changes over time. Really, white people in America meant only Northern and Western Europeans, primarily the British, the French, and the Germans. But when the Irish arrived en masse in the 1840s, they were not considered white. They only became white over time, even though their skin is fair as a German person's or a British person's. When Jews and Italians and Hungarians and Slavs arrived a little bit later in the 1860s, they were not generally considered white either. But today, of course, all of these groups are recognized as white. What do we call people from different races? This, of course, changes over time too. In the antebellum period, it was, of course, common to call Black people by the N-word, but then that changed to Negro, and then colored people, and then Blacks, and then African American, and today, the more general persons of color is in vogue. Of course, once thought appropriate to speak of East Asians as yellow or Oriental, but now that is a faux pas. Things get more confusing with all the different types of racism that are out there. There is the obvious blatant racism that you find in the KKK or Nazi Germany. No one questions whether Dylan Roof, that white young man who shot up Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, is a racist. But that kind of violent racism seems to be quite different than what happens when your uncle has a little too much to drink at Thanksgiving and starts sharing his views a little more liberally. And that is different from what happens when your real estate agent urges you not to consider a home because it's in a rough part of town or because the schools aren't great. So it's not uncommon to hear folks use terms like systemic racism or institutional racism, and others you might hear speak of reverse racism. So what to make of all of this? There are so many ways of thinking and talking about race and racism. I think a good place for us to start is to get on the same page and clarify our terms. What is this idea of race? Before I get into that, excuse me, are there any questions, Jeff? Are we good?
I don't see any in the chat feature, but if someone has one, this would be a good time. Otherwise, we can keep going. Why don't you keep going, Andrew? I'm not seeing
great.
Anything.
Yeah, and feel free to write those in at any point. The truth is that the racial categories that we notice all around us and use to talk about ourselves and other people would seem entirely strange to anybody who lived before the late Middle Ages. This means that as strange as it might sound, there were no Black people, no brown people, and no white people before about the 15th century. Now, of course, there were people with darker skin than my skin, but skin color has not always been the primary way that human beings categorize themselves. We know that the ancient Israelites in the Old Testament drew very sharp distinctions between them and other groups like the Hittites or the Moabites or the Egyptians. The Israelites were set apart as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. To be an Israelite meant to have a special religious purpose. But Joseph became a major player in ancient Egypt despite not having been born to Egyptians. And Moses was able to pass as an Egyptian after being adopted by an Egyptian princess. In other words, these weren't racial markers. These were just, to be a Jew meant to have a special religious purpose. And you could move around between these different identities. In ancient Greece, the primary distinction in society was between citizens who were voting members of the polis, such as Athens or Sparta, and the barbarians who lived outside the state. So if you lived in Athens, you had special duties and obligations to other Athenians, but you didn't have any special duties or obligations to barbarians who lived outside the city walls. There was nothing that made you indelibly Athenian or Spartan. This remained true in the Roman Empire too, where people of all different ethnic and cultural groups could become citizens of Rome. We know that Saul of Tarsus, who later became the Apostle Paul, was a Middle Eastern Jew who also happened to be a Roman citizen. So in the ancient world, they recognized different people groups. They called ethnos or gens in Latin, but the basis for these different labels was ethnic and cultural, not racial. So what's the difference? I've got this kind of on the screen for you to see, but let's just parse this out. Oops. Ethnicities are groups of people who share a common ancestry, usually from a particular geographical location, along with cultural practices, common language, common values, rituals, and customs. So examples of ethnic groups would be Norwegians, Swedes, Poles, Mexicans, Irish. And if you visited Chicago or New York in the early 19th century, you would have found ethnic enclaves where recent immigrants from Poland or Ireland or Germany all lived together, all spoke the same language, all ate the same food, all celebrated the same holidays, all helped each other find all of these kind of ways of living in common. And usually you can move in and out of these groups pretty easily. If you marry a Norwegian, like I did, or a descendant of Norwegians, you can learn to make lefse, to wear Norwegian sweaters, to tear up when you hear a beautiful savior, and the baseline of children of the Heavenly Father, to baptize your infants. All of these things I've learned to do, even though I wasn't born as a Norwegian. So while Norwegians will probably always think their culture is a little bit better than that of the Swedes, there's no overarching hierarchy of ethnicities. It's not generally accepted that the French are somehow superior to the British, although the French probably think so. Now, racial groups are different in all of these ways. A race is a subgroup of the human population that is thought to be distinguishable from other subgroups by a supposedly biological essence. This essence appears in phenotypical differences such as skin color, facial features, and body structure. And it's also believed that this biological essence, this thing in your genes, determines the kind of mental and moral capacities of members of that group. So this means that you, according to race, these racial groups, you're supposed to be able to decipher somebody's intellectual powers, whether they're smart or dumb or perceptive or imaginative, and their moral characteristics, whether they're lazy or hardworking or prone to criminality, based on how their physical appearance looks. So the difference here is that unlike ethnicity, race is thought to be based in our biology, specifically in our blood. It's something that you're born with and that you cannot change. So you might remember a few years ago when Rachel Dolezal, who was a white woman who presented herself as a Black woman and actually became a leader in the NAACP in the Pacific Northwest. But then she was outed by her family that she was in fact born to white parents and had been passing herself off as Black for all of these years. And there was, of course, a great uproar about this because there's something in the logic of race that didn't compute. You can't just decide one day when you wake up that you're going to be Black or Asian or white. You're born that way. That's how the logic of race works. Whereas ethnicity, there's a little bit more fluidity. You can learn to act like a British person. When I lived in England for a year, I started to kind of pick up some of their jargon. And I never probably passed as a British person, but I could kind of take on some of their traits. That's an important distinction. Just want to make sure that that's clear. This is often one of the major points of confusion when we talk about race.
Hey, Andrew.
Yeah.
Can I step in real quick? There's a question in the chat box that seems relevant at the moment. Allison asked, how do people know who was who when it comes to ethnicity, if I'm understanding that correctly, Allison?
Yeah, specifically on the last slide, when you were talking about ancient cultures, when there were these clear divides, how did they know who lived in the polis and who didn't? Was it like more markers of how people dressed or engaged with each other or something? Like, because we have race as this visual cue.
Right. No, in ancient Greece had some of that. So if you were a woman, you could not be a citizen. Just full stop. Aristotle thought that women were a different kind of thing than men. And so they just weren't. So in that sense, there was a visual, you can usually tell that a woman's a woman.
That's where it came from.
Yeah, it started before them, in fact, unfortunately, but, and it persists. But no, these were the 1,000 most wealthy people in a city were who the citizens were. And so they had political status, they had more wealth than anyone else, and they got to be the important people, the rich ones in the polis. But it wasn't written onto their face the way that it is with race. Okay. Any other questions, Jeff, or is that, we good?
I think we're good, thank you.
Okay. So the other thing about races I need to say is that they're almost always arranged hierarchically, meaning that there's a kind of general scheme about which ones are superior and which ones are inferior. And then no matter where in the world you go, the lighter skinned folks are always on top, and the darker skinned folks tend to be on lower rungs, with Black people in almost every racial scheme in the world, Brazil, South Africa, the United States, Europe, the Black people are at the bottom of these racial hierarchies. Now, none of these aspects of race were present in the ancient world. They thought of different groups as ethnically or religiously different, but not racially different. And to be sure, there was plenty of slavery in the ancient world, but this slavery wasn't based on race. Rather, groups enslaved other groups that they conquered. And so slavery was typically not generational. It was certainly not tied to being a part of a particular race or not. So if race is a more recent notion, where did it come from? And why did we start thinking in racial as opposed to simply ethnic terms? There's a history here. Act 1 is in Spain. Medieval Spain was a religiously diverse place. It had Catholics and Muslims and Jews. At one point, Muslims from North Africa advanced as far as Tours in modern-day France. But by the 1400s, the Christians had regained almost all of certainly all of France and almost all of Spain, except for the very southern province of Andalusia, which fell finally in 1492. Now, Spanish Christians were anxious about the remaining Jews and Muslims living in Spain. And the church and the state teamed up to force the remaining non-Christians to either convert to Christianity, to leave the country, or be killed. This is the institution called the Spanish Inquisition. Now, many Jews did convert to Christianity. Many others fled to places like the Middle East or Eastern Europe. These are the Sephardic Jews, the Sephardim. And many other Jews were killed because they refused to convert. But the Jews who did convert posed a problem to those Spanish Christians. On the one hand, they agreed to be baptized, they renounced their Jewish beliefs, and they confessed Jesus as the Christ. But some Christians were suspicious that these conversos were not really Christian, not really Christian. So they began to exclude people who were Jews who had converted to Christianity from obtaining public office, not because they had any Jewish beliefs per se, but because they had Jewish blood. These positions in government or church life required that one have a purity of blood, which meant that they didn't have any Jewish ancestors lurking in their family tree. Now, there had, of course, been a long history of anti-Judaism dating way back to the early Christians, but this is the first time that we see not anti-Judaism, but anti-Semitism. Discrimination against Jews not on the basis of their religious beliefs, because they'd converted, but instead on the basis of their blood, a biological feature of these people. And this story reaches, of course, a ghastly climax in the 20th century at places like Auschwitz and Dachau, when the Nazis attempted to cleanse their land of impure Jewish blood and restore its supposedly pure Aryan blood. So this is one origin of the talk of race in the West and really in the world. But the second act of the invention of race comes a bit later in the 1600s, and a few important shifts had to take place. So follow with me on this very condensed introduction to modernity. So first, the first big shift was the rise of natural science. Natural science emerged in the 1600s, and Europeans began studying human beings using the scientific method. This led to developments in anatomy and medicine, but also to the creation of a field called anthropology, the study of humans. And early anthropologists employed the same techniques of classification used to place plants and animals into genus and species groups to classify human beings into different races, subgroups of the human. So that's happening in the scientific world. Then in the political sphere, the rise of European colonial expansion. So the age of exploration meant that the Europeans were traveling far and wide, encountering all kinds of new cultures and people who looked very different, of course, than Belgians and Germans. Since the point of these travels was primarily about claiming territory for their sovereigns who'd sent them and discovering new natural resources, these European colonists had clear economic and political interests. They were there to plant their country's flag, to subdue the local population, and send wealth back home. The third movement was the rise of Enlightenment ethics. Now this is an expansive topic, but there's really 2 points here to name. The first is an idea called moral egalitarianism. This is the belief that all human beings are created equal. That wasn't the case in ancient Athens, as I just said. Aristotle thought that women were an inferior kind of creature to men, and that slaves were merely talking tools. So this idea that there's actually something fundamentally equal about every person, of course, then they're just using the term rights of men, so they're just thinking about men primarily. But the idea that all of us have some sort of intrinsic value is really a new political idea in the 1700s. That's the first idea. The second one is that because we're equal, proponents of Enlightenment ethics thought that we all have a fundamental right to be free, to chart our own course, to go about our lives unhindered by tyrants or the ruling class. So these 3 forces, natural science, colonialism, and Enlightenment ethics, combine to form a conflict. How can we say that all people are created equal with a fundamental right to freedom and, 1, take their land from them in the name of king and country, 2, enslave them, as happened in west and southern coast of Africa, and 3, siphon off their natural resources to send them back to places like London, Paris, and Madrid, and Brussels. So this problem that was faced by Europeans in the Age of Enlightenment produced this answer. If we claim that non-white people are not fully human, which means that they're not truly equal to white people, and thus they're not entitled to the same freedom to which white people are entitled, then all of a sudden this conflict goes away. And so the original idea of race was invented out of whole cloth. It's not in the ancient world. It was invented in a time and place. And it was invented for a purpose, to fill that gaping hole between the belief that human beings are somehow equal to one another and entitled to political freedom, and the practice, on the other hand, of slavery and colonization. Europeans could insist that all humans were equal and entitled to freedom because only white people were truly human. Black people, Native Americans, and others were considered varieties of subhuman. Because of their race, they were naturally thought to be less intelligent, less hardworking, and therefore less capable of ruling themselves. White people, on the other hand, were a superior race of human being. This means that it's not just the right of white people, but their duty to govern and civilize these not quite human populations who all have darker skin. It is for the good of society and for the good of non-white races, or so this thought went. So that's where this idea of race began. The original idea of race, just to clarify it more concretely, had 4 parts, and now we all know that those 4 parts are false. The first part was that humans can somehow be neatly divided into distinct subgroups called races. We know that's false. The genetic differences between racial groups are really small and insignificant. Any differences are most likely the result of selective reproduction over generations, which is a matter of social practice, not biology. So there's nothing in our genes that make white people essentially white or black people essentially black. Our skin does look different, that's true, but there's nothing based in some kind of genetic material or essence that makes us that way. 2, race is not rooted in biology. That's false. We've just seen that race didn't exist in the ancient world. It was invented in the modern world for a particular purpose. That is to resolve the contradiction between the belief in human equality and the practice of slavery and colonialism. 3rd, the original idea of race held that racial groups have naturally different intellectual powers and moral qualities, but we now know that this is false too. It's certainly true that some human beings are smarter than others and some of us are harder working than others, but there's no correlation between how smart you are or how hardworking you are and your race. That's been disproven. And 4th, there is this idea of white supremacy, that whites are the superior race. This has also been shown to be false. Human beings are human beings. There's no evidence that white people are naturally smarter or harder working than anybody else. There's also no evidence that black people are better at basketball or that they're lazier or more prone to criminality than anyone else. So if the idea of race is demonstrably false, as I've suggested, why is it still around? If race were just a bad idea, then it could easily be corrected through proper education. Our ancestors used to think that the earth was flat, but they kept doing more research and they realized that that was wrong. And the earth was actually round. So most of us now know that the earth is round and it's generally accepted. Problem solved. But with race, it hasn't proven so simple. This bad idea has shown an incredible staying power, and it continues to shape behavior in significant ways long after most people stop believing in it. How is that possible? How did race, an idea invented out of whole cloth with no basis in reality, become so real to us? So real that it correlates to how much money we have in the bank, to what kind of education we get, the kind of value we have in our home, our access to medical care, our life expectancy, the chances of being incarcerated or being shot by the police. To understand this, we need to know that race is more than an idea, more than the normal prejudice that we feel towards those who are different than us. It's also an institution with a history. So I'm not going to go into these next 2 points in as much detail as the first, but I do think I just want to cover these briefly. So real quick, Jeff, are we doing okay on questions so far?
Yes, there is one quick one that you may have addressed. I'm not sure I know this phrase, but David and Kristen from Northminster Presbyterian ask, is the hierarchy of race related to great chain of being ideas in Europe?
Excellent question. Yes, that there is the idea of the great chain of being is that there is an order to all reality with God at the top and rocks and inanimate things at the bottom, And in between the top and the bottom, there's all different levels of being. The angels are just below God, humans are below the angels, and then animals are below humans. But so in the period of the 16th and 17th, 18th centuries, that human bit got stretched out, where white people were believed to assume a higher level on that great chain of being. Great historical point, whoever brought that up. That's good. And of course, the great chain of being was thought to be destroyed by modernity when people started climbing social rank all of a sudden. But instead, race became the new kind of de facto social order. Great. So, racial institutions. Again, these will be a little bit more brief because I won't have time to converse. So, an institution is, according to Sam Huntington, a stable, valued, recurring pattern of behavior. And these don't just happen overnight. Stable patterns emerge over time and become ingrained through practice and repetition until they become like second nature. These patterns get passed on from one generation to the next, sometimes intentionally, and sometimes just because it's the way things have always been done. A small example of this is holiday festivities. We just know what this family does every year when this comes around, and they just become expected. The institution of race, as I've just shown, began in a particular time for a particular purpose, and that was to justify European colonization projects and chattel slavery in the New World. And these practices would last for hundreds of years and have an immense impact on the world. Just to get a sense for that, at its height, the British Empire ruled some 24% of the world's population and almost as much of its landmass. So everywhere the British Empire went, the idea of white racial superiority and non-white inferiority went with it. Between 1550 and 1850, some 10 million Black people were shipped from the west and southern coasts of Africa across the Atlantic to the New World. And everywhere these people with Black skin were enslaved, the idea of white racial superiority and Black inferiority went too. These institutions didn't just spread the idea of white supremacy. The people in charge of these institutions effectively created a whole world and a social order that reflected this idea of white supremacy. Excuse me. So while there's no biological basis for white superiority, white Europeans used these mechanisms to manufacture a world where white people were always on top and Black people were always on the bottom of the pecking order. This was true in pre-Civil War USA. It was true in Dutch South Africa. It was true in British Kenya. And it was true in Portuguese Brazil. All around the world, white people ruled over populations of darker skinned people. All around the world, white people were privy to educational opportunities from which darker skinned people were excluded. All around the world, white people were privy to business opportunities from which darker skinned people were excluded. These mechanisms institutionalized race. They repeatedly enacted these recurring patterns of behavior, these institutions, so that they became like second nature to all of these places all across the world. Race went from being an idea that no one had ever heard of to a fundamental building block of the social and political order. So sometimes when you hear talk of institutional racism or structural racism, this is the idea that people have in mind. In addition to the individual prejudices lurking in our hearts or in the corners of our mind, there are also much broader, deeply ingrained patterns of behavior that benefit white people and harm persons of color. And as we'll see in the era following the civil rights movement, when racial prejudice against Black people dropped significantly in the US, these recurring patterns of human behavior persisted long afterwards. But that's moving ahead. The history of race as an institution is really a global story, but since our focus in this class is on American life, I'm going to limit attention to chattel slavery in the United States and ignore most of the other instances of colonialism around the world, simply because in the United States, the legacy of chattel slavery looms the largest, I think. Of course, that was not the only racial institution in the United States. Native Americans were expropriated from their lands, and genocide was committed against them too. And that was fueled by a racist idea that Native Americans are savages and that white people are the civilizers coming to reform them. So one could do a history race from a lot of different angles, and you have to be selective for a short class like this. So we'll focus really on America and particularly on white-black relations more than others. So it's just worth noting that Black people were not the only race that was oppressed in the U.S., but they were the only ones that were enslaved as a race. So it seems appropriate to do so. Okay, so we'll cover all of that history in more depth over the next 2 classes, but the punchline of this story is that the idea of race has become woven into every facet of American life. Indeed, it's been woven into the fabric of every single American, which leads me to my next point, race as sin. So it's worrying enough that race has come to shape our societies, but what's even more troubling is the way that it shaped our inner lives. Most Americans of any race say that they aren't racists, and I think it makes sense to generally take them at their word. But recent studies in social psychology have shown that even those good people exhibit racial biases in their actions. Even those of us who reject racism in principle and who believe in racial equality and desire racial justice frequently act in ways that are racially discriminatory, even though we don't know it. This is called implicit racial bias, and this is really the center of my dissertation research. We'll come to this in earnest in our 4th session. These are racially biased behaviors we don't know we have and we cannot directly control. These biases are unintentional. They're triggered automatically by stimuli in our environment, so we don't choose to act in a discriminatory way. Further, when these implicit biases do get triggered, we don't know it's happening. Our unconscious biases. So the only way to reveal them is through fancy scientific experiments. And in most cases, these studies have shown that a majority of Americans, both white and Black and other races, link Black people automatically with negative cultural stereotype of dangerous, criminal, threat, and unintelligent. Now, what's so terrifying about these biases is that they're pervasive. They occur in people who are explicitly prejudiced and those who don't have explicit prejudice. In both types, these biases have been shown to influence hiring decisions and promotions, medical doctors' decisions about how much pain medicine to prescribe to patients, and they affect split-second decisions about whether a person is holding a handgun or a cell phone. And they can even influence police officers' judgments about whether or not to use lethal force. We'll study some of these in detail. But for now, the important thing to recognize is that all of us, Black and white, have internalized to some degree these automatic implicit biases against Black people that we cannot easily control. We have these biases simply by virtue of living in a world where race has become so important. Now, this doesn't mean that we're stuck. These can be changed with lots of intentional practices and trainings. But this does mean that race and racism are not just bad ideas from a bygone era, and they're not just an ugly part of our history that we can safely leave in the past. Neither are they just inner city issues that don't really affect us in the suburbs or rural areas. It means that race and racism are much closer to us than we'd like to think, infiltrating the inner recesses of our unconscious minds, guiding our decisions even when we try our best to avoid it, and causing the very evils that we detest. My last point is to talk a bit about sin. So how do we as Christians think about this power that rules over us, that causes us to do things that we don't want to do, and yet we detest and can't seem to stop it? For thousands of years, Christians have had this idea of sin to talk about just this kind of thing. In Romans 7, Paul writes these words, "I do not understand my own actions. I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Now, if I do what I do not want, it's no longer I that do it, but sin that dwells within me. I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord." What Paul describes here is an almost demonic power that's taken hold of him. He wants to do what's right, but sin has gotten the better of him, taken him captive, and now it courses through his veins and all of his actions, bending them towards evil. A few hundred years later, St. Augustine wrote about the power of sin as something that we inherit from those that came before us. Adam and Eve committed the original sin. They bit into the fruit, not you and me, but their single act of rebellion snowballed. By distorting human nature itself, their first evil took on a life of its own and created exponentially more evil in the world. I think that what I'm trying to suggest is that chattel slavery as an institution in the United States is kind of like that. That it got started as a false idea that took hold of our nation and of much of the world, shaping all that comes after it. And this has, whether we like it or not, shaped each of us in ways that we cannot control and that we're not able to get out of its grip. So the interesting thing for Christians is that even though they've admitted this really dour, kind of desperate part of human nature for millennia, that being incapable of freeing yourself from this evil doesn't make you not responsible for it. So at every stage of Christian history, Christians have both affirmed the reality of sin, that it has some kind of control over us, and yet it still exists that we are responsible before God for trying to heal the effects of these evil actions that we create and those that have been committed before us. And so the kind of larger framework I want to think about as we reach deeper and deeper into American history is how we can think of this as a sin that we can't quite get our heads around, but that we still can try to prove responsible in relation to it. So that is the first step, though, of taking responsibility is figuring out how we got here. And so the next few sessions will be trying to parse that out in more detail. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. That's the presentation. But I hope that when we break out into groups, you can engage what I've discussed, but also these questions a little more directly. So since not everyone knows each other, when you break out into groups, introduce yourselves to one another. And then maybe start by just saying what one reason is you've decided to join us tonight and hopefully for the next few weeks. And then maybe mention one idea that's popped out to you from tonight's presentation, something that you found confusing or surprising, worthy of some more reflection. And then we'll take a few minutes, 15 minutes, I think, to go through this. And then when we come back, elect somebody to be your spokesperson who can share what you've talked about with the group as a whole. So without further ado, Jeff,